Good evening, everybody. This is Divided We Stand. I hope everybody can hear me. If you have a problem, tell me. If it's too loud, too soft, tell me. So, anyway, good evening, everybody. It's Saturday, July the 1st, here from Bridgeton, New Jersey. This is Divided We Stand, the Divided We Stand channel on YouTube. If you're unfamiliar with the channel, please feel free to subscribe. We are not monetized. We also have a Facebook page called the Divided We Stand Facebook group page, which is fairly popular. And if you're interested in something like that, please become a member. I want to thank some of the folks who are here already tonight. That would be Veg from, he says it's the armpit of Canada, but let's just say he's from London, Ontario, which is just fine. Although they're smoking up there and spreading it down here. We have Gary Peacock. Good to see you, Gary. We have Anthony Davis from down in Texas. I'm going to guess Dallas, right? Something like that. And we've got Joey Fulcher here from my old hometown of Cherry Hill, New Jersey. So it's great to see you folks, and whoever else is passing by, it's great to see you. If you're watching this after the broadcast, again, please feel free to subscribe. We appreciate it very, very much. We're not looking for anything from you, just our ability to commiserate with you and such. So, like now, to take a moment here to introduce my great co-host, and that would be David Price out of Arlington, Virginia, and more or less kind of Washington. Dave, it's good to see you. I haven't spoken to you since last week during the show. How
No,
are
we
you?
haven't we haven't talked at all. So this will be a complete surprise to me, complete surprise to you, and of course a surprise to our listeners and viewers. I'd like to echo your thoughts for everybody who's watching tonight live. Thank you for doing that. Tell your friends, tell your neighbors, put a big sign in your yard. Um, it's getting scary, Brian. I see Anti-Gaia says that. I don't know if he's speaking to you or the situation out there, but I think this week I do consider myself sort of a Washingtonian. As I mentioned, I live 3 metro stops from D.C., exactly 2.6 miles from the White House, 1.9 miles from the Pentagon. Uh, Only here for a moment. Oh, Lord. Okay, Nina, welcome. So this week, a lot of news came out of D.C. from a place that makes a lot of news, usually makes a lot of news in June, and that's the Supreme Court. And I
Right.
think we've got tonight, we've probably got at least 4, maybe even 5 decisions that they've done that kind of, again, shows how divided our country is, and shows maybe how out of touch the Supreme Court is with the wishes of the majority of people. So I don't know, Brian, which one you feel was the biggest case, but I'd like to start tonight with race-linked admissions struck down.
Sure. Wherever you want to
I
start,
think,
it's fine with me.
I think now, ever since I can remember, no, yes, I would say ever since I can remember, I became politically aware about the same time our listener Gary Peacock did, probably as juniors in high school. We've been discussing affirmative action, and of course, what affirmative action is designed to do is to equalize the playing field, if you will. All right, and we all know that that sometimes involves color. It can involve economic status. It can involve a number of things. But this week, the Supreme Court voted down. They don't vote. They ruled that race cannot be a factor in the admission. Now, there were 2 schools involved in that suit, Harvard being one and University of North Carolina being the other. And I find that kind of interesting, not that there's any tie into that, but Harvard would be a representative of the most elite schools in the country, right? Ivy League, Stanford, Chicago, etc.
Right.
University of North Carolina is one of the leading, if not the leading, state university in the nation. So you're looking at 2 of the top schools. And basically, they were using, to make sure they had a diverse student body, they were using race as a qualification. Now, those that are opposed to affirmative action say, scream, unfair, unfair, unfair. Well, if the Supreme Court were really concerned about fairness, they don't have a case before it. But I'd be interested to see, Brian, how they would rule on legacy enrollment. At some colleges, that's 25% of their enrollment. And what, for anyone who doesn't know, I'm sure most of our listeners know, um, that what that means is if you had a relative, normally a father, grandfather, who goes to a university, that you can kind of maybe be a little bit below their standard and get in. Of course, you could also be above their standard, but that's legacy. Now, what I think so was interesting too about the affirmative action case is you have two of the 9 justices who actually were benefits or received benefits from the affirmative action rulings. One being Clarence Thomas, of course, and the other being Judge Sotomayor, Sonia Sotomayor. And looking at the same case, which is not surprising, they came up with 2 very different conclusions. Thomas, no surprise here, sided with the majority opinion, and the vote was 6-3, which, of course, breaks down along conservative liberal lines. Again, no real surprise there. What I did think was interesting is Clarence Thomas must have thought this was a pretty big case because, I'm quoting him here, I just want to get the quote right. Treating anyone differently based on skin color is oppression. Let me repeat that. Treating anyone differently based on skin color is oppression. Well, on the surface, maybe that's kind of hard to argue against, right? But the fact becomes that people of color are treated differently almost from the day they're born. Anybody who doesn't believe that is wrong. I'm sorry. I won't entertain any argument on that. I remember somebody you know well, a former teacher at Bridgeton High School, Nina Hendricks. And I'm going to use Nina as an example tonight. She was a phenomenal teacher, one of the best that we had in the high school, no question about that. Nina was black, and she dressed not to impress, but she was impressive with her dress, if that makes any sense. She certainly very careful about how she spoke. Certainly someone you would be proud to call an American. And one time we were having a discussion. In fact, it was right across from the courthouse down in Mays Landing, which is near the shore. We were at a workshop. And I don't know we were just talking about different things. And I said to Nina, she said to me, she looked at me, and she said, I'm being stared at. And it just didn't dawn on me what she meant. And I looked around and said, what do you mean? She said, no, just look. She said, look at the makeup of this place. And I looked around, and every person in this cafe was white. All right. And I said, well, Nina, I don't know. Maybe she said, no. Let me tell you something. She said, I dress like this, and I'm not, I'm treated one way. She said, but if I'm home on Saturday and I'm cleaning the floors and I've got my do-rag on, she didn't use the word do-rag, but I've got my head scarf on, protecting my hair, and I go out, immediately I'm followed. And I think sometimes as white Americans, we don't quite get that. We can't, right? The only thing you really have is if someone's anti-Semitic, they will not like you based on your last name.
Right.
Fortunately or unfortunately, I've said before, for no other reason than my father had sex with my mother and I was created, I came out at the top of the American food chain. White, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, male, heterosexual, upper middle class family, college educated now, and those 2 qualifications. Nobody ever stared at me because of that, unless I went into an all-black bar, which I did a couple of times with my friends, and then I might be looked at. But let's get back to the court case for a moment. It has big ramifications. Would you agree, Brian, that if you're a graduate of Harvard or the University of North Carolina, you probably stand a pretty good chance of getting a job, right?
Sure.
And if you're if you're denied entrance because of things that have happened prior in your life, then the diversity doesn't just stop in college. It'll be harder to get diversity law firms, diversity, wherever college degrees or law degrees are necessary. Nobody should be surprised about this. Put up a couple of quotes. I want to comment them because a couple
Sure.
of them were pretty good about this idea of affirmative action.
Well, one personal thing there, but let's see. What about legacy admissions?
Yeah, and that's veg, and that's what I was talking about earlier. I mentioned that, and I think that's now what the Supreme Court would say in that instance is there hasn't been a case before it. I would tomorrow, well, tomorrow's Sunday, Monday, if I wanted to challenge the fairness of this, I would certainly try to get a case going that would talk about legacy admissions. I mean, if you're going to say, as Justice Roberts said, the student must be treated based on his or her experiences as an individual, not on the basis of race. Now, Judge Sotomayor comes back and she says, the court stands in the way and rolls back decades of precedent and momentous progress. And I think that's what we're finding with this conservative court. And we'll talk about a couple other cases tonight. But what they're doing is, I think there's two things. Number one, it's no question they're rolling it back, right? That's not even an issue. That we're going back to a time, the case last year. 49 years, Roe v. Wade was the law of the land. Supreme Court issues a ruling, it's no longer the law of the land. Affirmative action since the 60s, moving forward. Now they make a case to drive it back. What do you think, Brian, about affirmative action and what the Supreme Court did?
Well, first of all, I just thought it was kind of interesting. Again, maybe I don't know enough about this, I mean, in depth to really comment, but I do know that this didn't apply to the military. And I was wondering, why did they just leave the military out of this? But in terms of college admissions, it was important to them. Because there are a lot of people, you look on CNN, you'll see opinions, well, why the Supreme Court got this thing right. So there are a lot of people who were actually for this. It goes back to, I guess, to the Bakke case. Think about that. The guy, the South African guy, or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
My problem, Dave, is I think a more generic problem when I keep seeing these decisions 6-3. I think a lot of people may have seen the decision a couple of days before, where there was some hope because they were talking. The Supreme Court was ruling on states' rights for picking their electors, which in theirs, luckily they came to their senses, for the exception, of course, Alito and Thomas and Gorsuch. But when it gets down to it, and I think I'm kind of like just being like the average American, and that when it comes down to a 6-3 decision, you say, what, this is really a political decision. I don't know. I mean, of course, someone like Roberts is going to say that this was solely about you can't have any type of advantages for any specific race. But although he does make some comment at the end to try to get himself out, I still believe that this court is absolutely political. But in this case, even though it is political, that the three were correct, I think you have to go deeply into it because, as you said, now what you're saying, Dave, is kind of like a what about? Well, if you're going to play the game this way, then why are you allowing, legacy admissions? And I think you and I both understand the concept of fairness. If somebody gets a 90 on the test and another person gets an 89, the one that 90 deserves to get in. However, it's not that simple. And so that nuance, that argument that you can't simply go on the scores, especially since you don't have the other things ironed out yet. But as you just said, legacy admissions, just like you have legacy wealth and everything else. Those things aren't ironed out. So it lets the Supreme Court do this very thing of, in the guise of being fair, they make a decision, but in reality, behind the door, we know that, in that brain of theirs, that it was basically a political decision in the sense that it was probably, the argument is there to continue what was before, but they didn't do it. But it doesn't seem like they care about precedent anymore. Am I correct? I mean,
I think
precedent's out the door now.
that's huge. I mean, that's if nothing else, it's proved that this court they could deny being political. I agree with you; they are political, but certainly no one can deny that this court, for all its claims of having originalists on the court, is certainly not adhering at all to precedent when it
Well, Roe
when
v.
they want
Wade
to
is
change
another
it.
example. Right.
When they want to change it. Now, what's interesting though, Brian, I'm going to take another little tactic here and say there are a couple of things that maybe aren't so bad about this ruling. Because, okay, what's bad is that America elected Donald Trump. That's bad. More than we know. Donald Trump appointed 3 members of the Supreme Court. 1/3 of the court are Donald Trump appointees. Donald Trump will never know his feeling, liberal political. All Donald Trump cares is a narcissist. But he was kissing ass with the Republicans, and certainly those conservative Republicans. And when I say conservative Republicans, I'm not just talking about the crazy right. I'm talking about even the Mitch McConnells and some people who claim to be somewhat fair. They were very happy with those appointments, and they were able to get them through. Now, Global Solidarity says education is a business not for learning, need a profit. And that, of course, is true. What I think will be interesting, though, if colleges get selected, one of the things that may come out of this, and is really abandoning the SATs and the GREs. As an educator and working for 5 years with Johns Hopkins, I did a few studies on that. And with the SAT, there's only one correlation between SAT and college success. The higher your score entering, right? You take it in your senior year, junior, senior year, whatever you take it, the more chance there is of you completing your freshman year. After that, all bets are off. So maybe colleges can creatively find a way by giving more emphasis to maybe the college application essay. If someone can demonstrate, for example, the struggle that they've had if they're from a poor community or a Native American on a reservation or someone. And that's true also, Anthony. You know, you could argue very strongly that certainly all black schools do not get the same education as all white schools. They just don't. I mean, that's just a fact. I feel comfortable saying it. I feel I'm on solid ground saying it. Now, that doesn't mean there are great teachers in black schools. What it means is there's so many problems coming out of there. They're systemic. But again, maybe, just maybe, we can find a more creative way to do admissions than the way it's done now. And maybe get away from this testing. The second reason I think it's good, and this is, my feeling is, how does a minority person now vote for the Republicans? How? We know very few of them are doing it, but how? I mean, really, they've just said, we're taking away all these benefits that you should have because you shouldn't have them.
It's got to be personal gain or stupidity.
Right.
I mean, either one.
Right. But of course, I think what it also speaks of, right? He is hardly justice. Well, of course. I still don't quite understand that, Brian. I never will. I think if I were President Obama, again, it's easy to say I'm not. I think I would have just gone out and sat and held my breath until I turned blue like a little kid. I honestly don't think he fought it enough. I really don't. Now,
Right.
I
agree with you.
I mean, wasn't there, but I certainly, would made more of an issue out of it. But again, as we've said before, we don't know what President Obama's goals were. I think one of his goals was to be, and he succeeded with that, to be the first African-American president. That can never be taken away from him. Another one was to be reelected to show that African-American president can do 8 years worth of good work based on the majority of people. So I don't know how that fit in with that. But I mean, we know now. And then you've got Ruth Bader Ginsburg's decision, of course. And I believe that what some columnists have said is she wanted to be have her successor named by the first female president of the United States, which she believed would be Hillary Clinton. And I think about 65 or 70% of the American people believe that. and I put myself in that category. But when you talk about it being political, I think education, and that's what I want to talk about now just for a minute, education is going to be, to use Donald Trump's words, huge. No, Donald, there's an H there, not a Y. Huge in the 2024 election. What makes me say that? All right. With COVID, right? When COVID came in, we started to see this groundswell of parents wanting their kids to go back, right? I mean,
Right.
that's really what it was. They want their kids
Right.
to go back to school. They didn't care. They didn't believe. They didn't. They didn't think it was bad, et cetera, et cetera. And that was followed up by an attack on critical race theory. And critical race theory, it's kind of hard to understand, but basically, if you take it down, I think to its essence, it's saying that race has been an issue since day one in America and continues to be. And you look at it historically of where it's an issue. Well, slaves built the White House. We stop there. Okay. I mean, how much further do we have to go? You can begin and end with slavery and look at it that way. Then in this past year, you've seen, and we'll talk about this later with the Supreme Court ruling, how this political right, radical right, religious right, Supreme Court right, all coming together. You've got gender identity now. What should be taught. At what age is it appropriate to discuss issues like homosexuality, transgender, and of course for many people it's never that age, and that leads us to one of the big issues, book banning.
Right.
So what I'm kind of hoping for is that although this issue it certainly is not good for minorities, that it can be turned around in such a way to assure that Republicans do not continue to control where they continue. Now, that's not going to happen in Idaho. It's not going to happen in Wyoming. It's not going to happen in Montana. It's probably not going to happen in Alabama. It's not going to happen in Mississippi.
Or even Ohio.
Well, but Ohio has enough. I think, again, repeat myself, but, I think the presidential race in 2024 will be a swing from Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Minnesota, Wisconsin. Those 5 states will determine. And of those, I agree with you, Brian. You went to Bowling Green, so you're familiar with Ohio, but Ohio is probably the most conservative of those at this point. Michigan probably being the most liberal. Pennsylvania is really a split state. Pennsylvania is interesting. It's almost like America, right? You have the 2 coasts in America.
Right.
And in Pennsylvania, you have the 2 cities, Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. Can Pittsburgh and Philadelphia outvote the rest? Just like, you can do that. A couple other things happened this week, though, that 2 of which also disturbed me about education still. So we've got the Supreme Court thing, but we've also got your friend, Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida. I don't know if you saw what he did. It didn't really make a big news splash, but it's interesting. Late in this week, I think it was Thursday. I don't think it was yesterday. I think it was Thursday. He called to abolish the Department of Education in Florida.
Interesting.
Well, we know why. He's trying to become the darling of the whack right. I mean, that's what he's doing, and he's having a hard time. He's not getting any traction. So I think, he's been leading with the book bans in Florida, and then he lies, which of course, politicians have been known to do. He's actually come forward and said there are no book bans in Florida. That is not true. There are book bans in Florida. And then there's another group that I think I want to bring up tonight for people getting this education before we get off this. Excuse me. There's a national movement starting an organization. It's a new organization, came out of COVID, called Moms for Liberty. Now, what kind of organization do you think that is, Brian?
Well, just with that title, it's usually the opposite of what it says. So it sounds like some right wing,
It is, and it's so right wing, and it's growing state by state. It's so right wing that the Southern Poverty Law Center, which I think is Mars D is the founder of that, they're just tremendous. They've done tremendous work. I think, although the ACLU has probably been more effective in court cases, Southern Poverty Law Center has done a lot. What they say about this organization, they've already labeled it as an extremist group, the same way they label the Klan and the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers. So don't anybody fall for that. So I think the point is we start with the Supreme Court, but that wasn't the only ruling they have, and then we can look into the education. Um, Another minority group of Americans that I think should be certainly concerned with a ruling. I don't know if you followed that. Did you follow the one about the Colorado web designer? Did you follow that at all,
Yes,
Brian?
isn't he the one that wouldn't he doesn't want to offer his business to transgender or
Yeah, what
using
basically,
religion as a way of being
yeah,
able to say
it's a female who owns this web design shop, and she doesn't want to make any kinds of websites or anything promoting gay marriage.
hmm,
Now, what's interesting about this case is it wasn't even a case. Nobody asked. She brought it, and they heard it, even though it hasn't gone to any court. Which again, kind of interesting that there hasn't been. It wasn't like, remember the cake case where the baker refused to do a cake
yes, yes.
for a gay marriage, and that also happened to be Colorado. I don't know what's going on in Colorado. Maybe it's too much pot being smoked. I don't know what's happening, but anyway, um, this case basically says simply that she has the right to do that. Well, does she? I don't know. But what I find interesting is what, again, your friend, Judge Neil Gorsuch, had to say about it. Now, listen to this. The First Amendment belongs to all, not just speakers whose motives the government finds worthy. Well, let's look at that. Actually, that's not such a bad thing, right? I mean, the government shouldn't decide what we should say, and that's the First Amendment. But the question becomes where it's sort of like, where does an individual's rights stop and society's rights take over? Or here, which is a higher calling, right? Is and more so that you should serve all people. They're also clear to point out, and this gets to a number of comments we have every week about the idea of big business and running America, that this does not necessarily apply to the Holiday Inn or some other places. This was just done for this one case. But certainly it is another small bite out of the trend, the movement, if you will, the progress. The Roe v. Wade progress has been halted, or at least pushed back. Affirmative action halted and moved back. Now we have a gay rights ruling that certainly moves it back. I don't know. I mean, where do you agree with the ruling, Brian? Do you disagree with the ruling? You split. What do you think?
Now you're talking about this particular one that you were
This
bringing up.
particular, just the particular, the woman does not refuses to do gay marriage websites, wedding for gay marriage.
I am
Gorsuch,
completely against the ruling. I mean, that's I mean, like for example, I could say if I were a surgeon, say, okay, well, I'm I'm whatever, and I don't want to. I don't like this particular philosophy or religion of somebody, so I'm not going to operate on them. It goes back to what you're talking about with the case with the cake. There's some non-negotiables in our society, the separation of church and state, that kind of thing. So if you want to operate, within federal guidelines in terms of having business, we're talking about the welfare of the people around. That can apply to you not inviting that person over your house, but you better goddamn respect people, simply because they're born a certain religion or a certain color or whatever. You bite the bullet and you do the right thing, okay, and you don't pull that kind of crap. So if any decision bothers me the most, it's actually that decision. It's just it's unacceptable to me. It's un-American. It's actually inhumane, simply because your beliefs are different than something. Like I said, if you want to apply that, then we can do the whatabouts and say, okay,
right?
you don't
And
you don't believe in climate change. Well, you don't get your FEMA check. You don't believe in COVID. Well, you don't get your vaccine. Oh, you're sick from the vaccine? Well, I don't want to treat you. I mean, look, I'm taking this to another degree, but again, this is all within the background of these decisions are becoming political decisions. You mentioned DeSantis with the book. It's not the question of books that he really cares about. He knows where he's going with this. The schools, he's going local with everything. Just like Trump is saying, we're going to allow you to vote for your principal, and if you don't like the principal you have, you can vote him or her out. So again, it's extremely political. There's a difference between justice and law, and we all seek justice, but unfortunately, the way people interpret laws is political, that we don't get the justice. This is why we have so many, people who are upset with the decisions. I understand there are winners and losers with the Supreme Court decisions, and sometimes you just have to say, okay, that is the decision. But you can't tell me, Dave, and I know you're not telling me, that these decisions are smelling more and more political. I mean, they've always been kind of political, but at least, at some point you'd have somebody that would say, okay, this is just too far. I have to be rational about this. But now it's, aside from something they had to vote for a few days ago, you're going to get 6-3. 6-3 is going to be it for the next 2, 3, whatever number of years. In fact, we may see 6-3 until the day we die, Dave.
Well, I think that's a problem, because certainly Clarence Thomas is the oldest member of the court. He's 75. Now, Clarence Thomas may live to be 95. One thing I neglected to say, I mentioned what Mr. Thomas said, but do you know, Brian, I didn't know this, and I found it in an article I was looking at. That's the first time Judge Thomas, on the affirmative action decision, it's the first time in 3 decades he's spoken on a decision in the court.
Yeah, he's awfully quiet, and so now he speaks up. And the one issue, affirmative action, it's like it's like he's saying to his wife, "I got your back here, and the way I'm going to prove it, I'm going to take the one issue you would not expect me to say, and now I'm going to come out." You know what I mean?
And of course,
it's horrific.
Overarching over all the Supreme Court is now we have Thomas, who there's no doubt what he did should be illegal, but it isn't. Taking favors and riding on planes and getting boats and whatever the hell else he did. And you've got Alito, who did a couple very, shall we say, at least questionable dealings with people who later had business with the Supreme Court. So it's not like the Supreme Court is under the gun. Nothing will happen though. You mentioned, and we'll just touch briefly on that because it was good news, the idea that states cannot overrule elections, and I think that's huge. I mean, you got to take a victory where you get a victory. It's not going to happen often, maybe, or not much at all. But in this case, it did happen. And basically, what that said was, if you remember, Donald Trump was trying it. It's really kind of a slap at Trump and anybody trying to change the election. The state legislator cannot overturn an election. That's basically what it's saying.
Right, and Trump is, of course, saying that that's not true, which is, of course, ridiculous.
But the Supreme Court has said, no, you can't do that.
Right, you can't do that. Right.
So and so, I mean, at this point, that is one victory for democracy, if you will. Now, the court also, it was a busy week for the court. Also, I don't know if you're following it, said President Biden overstepped his bounds and his power in forgiving student loan debt. Now, student loan debt is kind of a big issue. That there's
even within the Democratic Party. I think that's
I mean, as I said, I don't think this is as clear cut as gay.
It's the other ones, right.
Because the question becomes, for a student, let's take the more conservative view. Nobody forces you to go to college, right? I mean, you choose to go. And colleges are not free. Unfortunately, as one of the comments tonight was, they are a business. There's no question about that. I don't know that they can't exist without money, and they make some money and what have you. And I don't know how much that balances out with education. You can't say that people don't get an education to go to college. I mean, that's not true. But is that the main purpose of college anymore? I'm not so sure that it's getting the money from those students who go so you can have it. But however, and you come out and you have some loan, maybe loan debts. Now, I know I've talked to some young people in D.C., by young people in their 30s, who have loans for college, master's, doctorate, and postdoc. But they chose to get that. So you could make that argument. The other side is that in civilized, if you will, democracies, the college is free. And it should be here. But since it's not, we'll forgive the debt. And part of Biden's ruling was the fact of what happened during COVID. In other words, they were trying to push for this. So basically, though, Biden comes along, and let me get his, first of all, he says, this is not a normal court. Well, okay. I would agree with that. Certainly not a normal court. It doesn't really reflect the past, and it doesn't really reflect America's value system. And I think that's true. I mean, what America's value system should be. But the problem becomes, what do you do about it? And of course, one of the things you could do, very difficult, but could do, is expand the court. And Biden still says that's not the way to go. Biden is still saying, and I have to respect that decision. Again, I may look back at it as I do on Obama's decision not to fight McConnell on denying the Supreme Court position. But at this point, what do you feel? I mean, student debt is a hard one. It really is.
Well, I think you've kind of answered it in a certain sense. I mean, yeah, there's a certain unfairness that letting somebody off the hook. On the other hand, the bottom line is you have to make college affordable for people. I mean, so if you just throw out the Supreme Court for a second, if you're going to go, for higher education or any type of education, you want to make it more affordable. We make, secondary education. Well, I mean, going to high school free, so to speak. Why not college? Why can't college be in that same category? I know there's an expense, and as you say, other parts of the world, and the benefit from it would be great because it makes a better society and it gets a more educated society. Again, we went into this long ago, after World War One, when the British lost many of their young officers, who went to universities, and because they would lead into battle, many of them died, and it had a great effect on the education. And then we, as Americans, we learned from that. Woodrow Wilson pushed for mandatory high school education, going to the age of 16 or whatever it was at the time. It's important. It would really, really benefit society. Now, you don't offer just everybody the chance to go to Harvard, but I think that what you're saying is, if I have it right, is we got a problem here, and many other countries seem to be able to deal with that in healthcare and other things. But again, the propaganda is out there that if you push for this, then people are going to say this is communism. This is they're trying to take over. So we're in a bad situation because now not only are you making it difficult for minorities to get in, just anybody who doesn't have the money, now it makes it even harder. So while the Supreme Court's trying to go by the law, just by saying this is black or white, literally, you don't have justice. So again, there's justice and then there's the law. And you're not getting fairness. You're not getting fair economics in the country, and you're certainly not getting anything else that's fair. And I don't know how you get around this other than having a court that goes in the opposite direction. And right now, and how do you do that? I mean, you say you stack the court. You can't do it because you got to have a route to get there.
You've got what? 5 conservative judges under the age of 50, right? Or 50, just around 50. And in their, that's a long time, considering that justices can serve as long as they want. Uh, yeah, Chuck and John, that's kind of the idea, but affordable in what sense? Okay, I'll take my alma mater for example, Villanova. I graduated Villanova in 1973, and my last year to get my senior year of college, room and board, was $7,500. Okay. Now, again, I understand we're talking 1973 wages, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Today, that same education is 75,000. Now, Villanova.
That's before you've earned a penny in most cases.
Correct. Now, Villanova is a private school. It's also a Catholic school. I didn't go there for the private school, the Catholic school. I went there. I really don't know why I went there. I have no idea. Actually, I will. I'll say why I did. It's kind of a stupid reason. So if anybody has children out there, use this as an example of what not to do. When I was in high school, I really had no idea what I wanted to do, Brian. I really didn't. I never had a clue what I wanted to do.
I don't think you or I still know. We're still working.
That's true too. But an English teacher one time stopped the class and said, "Mr. Price, you like to talk a lot and you don't say anything meaningful. Why don't you become a lawyer?" And that's really, so I put off applying to colleges, but I thought naively or stupidly that you had to go to the same school that you went to law school. So I just said, I actually applied in March of my senior year, which is extremely late. And I was accepted into, let's see, where was I accepted into? I was accepted into 4 colleges, Villanova being one of them. And I took Villanova as one of those to go. As you can see, I never became a lawyer. But the idea is, I'm talking about private school. Now, somebody said, aren't state schools more affordable? And the answer is yes. Okay. But what is affordable? $20,000, right? That's still $80,000 and it goes up. I mean, who can afford that? So, student loans become important. So one of the things I've thought about, did Socrates go to college? No, Socrates didn't, but he also, his wife convinced him to take poison. So maybe he should have gone to college. Maybe he would have been smarter. But of course, that's true. And Veg, you're saying that kind of tongue in cheek, or also it's a good question. However, today, unfortunately, college degree is necessary as a key, right? I mean, colleges have become just places to train workers. It's just today workers are working with computers and engineering rather than on assembly lines. Is it Global Solidarity here to answer your question? Is that one of the questions we didn't answer?
Well, no, I think it's just why do we have the colleges?
Yeah. Well,
why was it invented? Why was it invented?
Well, actually, college started in America really as religious schools, right? That's really what they were. And then to train the aristocracy. And some things, there are trade schools. Certainly, Anthony, that is true. I know that there are plumbers, carpenters, and other people who went to trade school that graduated with me who made far more money than I did my whole career. Maybe people should just boycott colleges. Interesting. The problem becomes, and I think that would be, I mean, that's certainly a way, but how do you get people to boycott when you're telling them you got to have a college degree? Yeah,
especially for certain things, like you said, if you're become a surgeon, you need to have some certification. Just like even a trade school, you'd have some cert for whatever you do. And obviously, the jump between high school to the bachelor degree to the master's, because they say between the master's and the doctorate, there's a great difference in the amount of knowledge. Well, now, I don't know that's to be true in all
fields
of study. But in some, it is true.
I have a son. We talk. He's a college professor, actually, at 3 different universities. At University of Alabama, where his home is based. Then he also the University of Chicago, and also has a 5-year project with the University of Australia. So he really sees it from the whole package. Alabama being kind of a depressed educational area, Chicago being arguably one of the best universities in America, and then of course the Australian system, which is far different than ours. And I've asked him, he makes a hell of a lot of money. Wow. So I said, but he's also said something that I think you have to pay some attention to. He said, I bring in far more with my research than goes out. And that's definitely true. Um, so if they pay him $400,000 and he brings in $2 million worth of grants and things for research, the college is ahead. His feeling is one of the things that's driving college costs up so much is the fact that they have too many deans and assistant deans, and it's like everything else, Brian. You see it in education at the high school level. How many bosses do you need? If you only have one high school, do you really need a superintendent? So there's ways to look at that, but at this point, I think we're back to what does a student do? I guess you just take out the loans and fight them as long as you can, but I don't see college costs going down.
Right.
I'd love to say.
Well, the demands, just in terms of speaking of economics, just the supply and demand, the demand is still there, despite the fact that there's demand for trade schools and things like that. Just as you say, the trade schools are fine; they can make money. However, not everybody's built for trade school, and not everybody's built for the university. The demand is still there. The demand is everywhere, and so it's just natural. And plus, with inflation anyway, that's going to go. So you have inflation, pressures of inflation, and then you have just simple supply and demand, and
And I
people want more pay.
and one of the problems you have is old timers say, "Well, I paid for my college. Why can't these kids?" Well, I think I'll just use again Villanova's example. It was far easier to get $7,500 in those days than it is $75,000 today.
Correct.
That you know,
But the demand's greater. Again, you go back to supply and demand. There is a greater demand to go to college than there was back then. A lot of people just never even thought they were going to college. In fact, the time that our parents, well, our fathers, your father was, I was older than my father, but my father goes back to 1921. It was very unusual even for students to finish high school in the 1930s.
well, that's what my dad used to say, sort of as a joke, but true. He said, "I spent 3 of my best years in 8th grade and then left." Now, I don't think he spent 3, but he never, he was one of those, he finished with an 8th grade education and that was all he ever had. And he became very successful. But again, different time. Can it be done today? Well, yeah, I suppose, but just not. And geez, if people stop going to colleges, we won't have the specialists. One can serve in the military and get educated. Again, Brian, just as you said, trade schools aren't for everybody. College isn't for everybody. The military isn't for everybody. I've thought for a while about this. I mean, just wondered as a start, maybe to phase it in. Maybe you could make community colleges or county colleges free, right? So you get 2 years of free education, and then it can go from there. Now, that community colleges are very affordable for the most part, but you could still save the money to apply to your next 2 years of college. The other thing that I think could be done, and it's done to a certain extent, like Teach for America, you could, if you provide 4 years, in 4 years of college, your college could be paid for if you give back 4 years, right? Yeah, I don't know how exactly that would work, but it would be like sort of like, remember the Richmond High School football stadium was built by the WPA, the Works Project
Right.
Act, and that was during the Depression, and so people were employed to do that, and they also employed artists to do murals. I mean, all kinds of things. The overall problem, I guess, is at this point, who is an American? And what does it mean to be an American? And what should you get if you're an American? The Supreme Court is saying one thing, and I think the majority of Americans, I don't know what percentage, Brian, but it seems to be the ones I've been seeing recently, the polls are about 65% more liberal tendencies, not necessarily liberals. Life should be a continuous education, no question about that. It is. It's just how people use it. Trucker John says that's what I did first 2 years in junior college and transferred to university. I remember as a teacher, I would tell students that's a great way to go. I'd also make an argument, Brian. I'd be interested in getting near wind down time, but this is an interesting kind of thing. I'm going to submit to you, kind of a radical thought, there are better teachers at community colleges than there are at universities. Would you agree or disagree?
Well, I can only go from my experience. I have taken a few courses at community colleges, and of course, I've been at a very large university, Bowling Green, which is the second largest in Ohio. I wasn't the worst for it. In fact, in a certain sense, it's more one to one. It's more like,
Right.
if you go to Walmart to buy something, or you go to the local hardware store, at least the person who works at the hardware store, you can almost immediately find something. The service is better, and I think that's the
Yes.
case with the community college.
And I would agree with that. I know there were in Cumberland County, where you reside and where I resided for 59 and a half years. Community college there, it's now actually taken over by a university, but it's still a community college. And they had two of the greatest English professors I've ever run across, ever. But they taught, and especially if what we're saying, and this gets scary too, the thing that we're also not addressing is every single indicator coming out, whether it's social studies, whether it's math, whether it's reading, whether it's writing, student scores are just continuing to drop, continuing to drop. And if that's the case, uh, what does that mean?
Well, can I ask you this, Dave? Because this gets
Sure.
more into pedagogy and things like that. But at the university level, it was my understanding that that type of teaching was different because the professor was actually professing. The professor, he or she, would
Mhm.
stand up there and speak to the class. He would transmit the information. If there were questions, they would be answered. But now, at least let's just talk about high school teaching now, which has changed greatly over the last 30 or 40 years. I've seen it. I started in 84. Now, you're differentiating your instruction. There's the group work. Um, Many more things going on than just simply lecturing. You're looking at learning styles. Where at the university level, that wasn't happening. I don't know if that's happening at all universities, but it's a different thing. And I think that the idea is that once you jump to the university level, it's the 18-year-old's um, obligation to be able to absorb that information on his or her own without any differentiation, and that's that. Now, I may be wrong about that. In fact, in Russia, it's you finish high school at 17, and then you either go to the university or you go to some trade school. But that's my understanding, is that there's a big difference between the teaching at a university, which is not per se teaching, it's more professing, lecturing. At least that's the clinical understanding of it in the past. I mean, even if
Well, I think
you went to university, you were in the 70s, you would see it. You'd be in a lecture hall, and the person would say,
right.
they might not even know your name for the entire semester.
No, and there are classes at some universities as large as 250 people, in a class, in a lecture hall. Let's see. Let's see what Judy says here. I worked as a therapist in high-risk communities for the federal court, which helped reduce my loan interest. And there you are. That's that idea. It worked for Judy. I think it could work for others. The drawback is, or one of the drawbacks is, um, people. Okay, this is put. It doesn't matter, except for the Supreme Court, I guess. Maybe that's why they're so atypical. People don't like change. What worked for me. Well, that what worked for me in 1973 isn't going to work in 2023. It's 50
Right.
years
They,
ago.
they, they want to apply, it's like a parent trying to apply their lives vicariously to their children. It's not your world anymore. You can't apply 1940 to 1980. And
Right.
this is the problem. And as you said, it went well for me. Well, then you'll do it the same way. Well, it's not the same thing. Everything is nuanced. Everything's
And
different.
the last thing I want to talk about uh, is how difficult it is to solve certain problems and how much race does come in. Something I've been following recently, and it's in Philadelphia. And like most cities, crime is increasing, and violent crime is increasing, and violent crimes with weapons are increasing. It's true of D.C., Chicago, Philadelphia, all these places. Uh, Not too long ago, there was a an involvement with a shooting of someone, teenager, African American teenager, both victim and assailant. And the assailant had a full ski mask on, right? And Philadelphia now, the not Philadelphia City, but the transit authority in Philadelphia has banned those masks, right? Now that sounds, and it's funny. I can remember the first time I went out in COVID with a mask on, and I thought, I looked in, you look in the window and you see yourself. I mean, I look like a bank robber as a joke, right? But certainly it's concealing your face. Well, the question now becomes that somebody will file against that and see. So I'm sure the transit authority thought it was doing something good, by banning this mask. The question becomes, should you be able to do it? And then it's interesting because there were laws in the 19th century that prohibited cross-dressing in America. So now we've got this gender thing coming up, transgender. Will that be resurrected? And I guess what I want to close with tonight is it's damn scary what the Supreme Court is doing. I think what else is scary is there aren't a lot of things we can do about it.
Right. Well, in fact, Dave, have you seen, or anybody else there? There's this documentary. I don't know which network it was. It was called El Dorado. But if you look back at, Germany in the early 1930s, when the gay community there would have, their
Right.
bars, and then, of course, Hitler came along and they instituted laws in the early 30s until eventually a lot of these people were sent to concentration camps. And then even after the war, these very people, like a famous tennis player, after the war, could not go to many of the tournaments because the laws still stayed in place in West Germany up to the 1960s. It was in the 50s. It was oppressive to these people. And you think, my God, this wasn't just, Hitler-esque. This thing was happening long after that. And now after these decisions, you wonder, was it, who's the fellow? I think he's homosexual. He's Jonathan Gephardt, or from Gephardt from MSNBC, and you could see how he was getting choked up after the decision. He was on, in place of Lawrence O'Donnell, I think it was last night, and it was tough to watch because this is nothing of any fault of their own, the way they're born, like anything else, and this is why I say it's extremely disturbing. They're all disturbing in some way, but some are more clear cut than others. And this certainly was horrific that they came to this decision. And I think it was Sotomayor who had a scathing dissent for what had happened. And like you say, this doesn't look good because these Supreme Court members, they are younger than we are, with the exception of Alito and Thomas. Because look at them here. All these people are younger than us here, and yeah. Maybe I don't know how old Kagan is, but
She's in her late 40s, I think, or early 50s.
well, it doesn't look good. This is not something that you or I are going to see our ways through, and we're going to have to live with it. It'd be like, again, living. Always make this analogy, and you've heard this before, Dave. But it's like somebody living in 1941 and they die in 41 or 42, not knowing whether we're going to defeat Germany or not. You see, so the war was never won for many people, especially if you died. And if you are part of that community, I don't know how you live with it. It's because I feel, my empathy is there. It is no fault. They have done nothing wrong.
I'm going to end my participation tonight by looking at Judy's question here and answering it as best I can. Why doesn't the Supreme Court have any accountability? It does, but it's very limited. If you have sex with 14 women in the corridor, you probably would get thrown off the Supreme Court. There was an old saying by a politician.
Well, you might want to ask Brett Kavanaugh about that. Of course.
Yeah, there you are, right? And Clarence Thomas too.
Clarence Thomas too. He had his commentary about the Coke can.
I think what happens is, this is why we can't rely on the founding fathers as much as we do. I think it was pretty much assumed that if you made it to the Supreme Court, you'd be an honest guy. when they put it in. Now, honest
Right.
guy, rich. Well, that isn't necessarily the way it is now. And put that up again at 50. What's that? 63. Okay, thanks,
63,
John.
right.
Put Judy's back up just for a minute. There was a second part to that.
Sure.
So the Supreme Court doesn't have an accountability. It was really designed that way, and I believe it was designed that way because they didn't think they would need it, and they never got around to it.
The only entity that is putting any accountability on the Supreme Court is the press. Because if it wasn't for the press, you wouldn't have had Alito had a
Right.
peremptory, op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, trying to protect his ass because he knew about that
Right.
trip and he knew it was going to come out. So, in
And
a certain sense, the press is the only thing now. And that's why you have to have a free press.
and how do we get some? Judy says. That is the question, because really it would involve. Do you really think the Supreme Court is going to govern itself? No, they're not going to put rules on. Right now, again, you're talking about, the politics of the Supreme Court. No Republican in their right mind is going to say anything or do anything to change the Supreme Court. Why would they? Right? It's their court. You could change the Constitution, but that still involves, getting Congress to act and this to do and that to do. So kind of a downbeat show this week. I think, I like to be more thinking about, what should I say, not thinking about positives, but trying to think about solutions. But this court thing, I don't know that I have an answer for it, Brian. So I'm going to leave with that. I'm going to get out of here.
Well, I think the first thing we have to do is let's just make sure Trump doesn't win, or a Republican candidate doesn't win the election, and then we can take this. You have to take care of the big issues, the biggest issue first, and that is the Republican Party and who is at the head.
And I'm going to add that I've not seen anyone impress me in the Republican Party to do anything better, and in some ways, maybe even worse, because DeSantis is smarter than Donald Trump, but he's trying to outright Donald Trump. That's scary. Okay.
Yeah, that is scary. Absolutely.
And so, good comments tonight from everybody based on those.
Big hand to them.
And thank you. And Brian, we'll see you next week. I'm out of here.
Now, next week, I forget what it is. I might have an issue. Dave, I will text you. I know that there's a possibility that I won't be able to make it next week. I think I have to be somewhere next week on a Saturday, and I'll figure that out ahead of time.
Let me know.
Okay. So, Dave, thank you. Interesting discussion. Again, it was not the most uplifting discussion, but this is life. And if anything, you're going to get the truth as we know it. So, well, Dave just popped out of there. So, Dave, hope everything's going well with you. Again, thank you. And thank you, everybody. Global Solidarity, Chillamam, Judy Washington, Joey, Franz, Veg, Anthony, Trucker John. If I don't get your name, folks, I really apologize. I'm trying to scoot through here, see if there are any more. But and those of you who are incognito, that's fine too. Very much appreciated. So I'm going to sign off. I hope to see you folks next week. I can't remember, but I might have something I have to deal with Saturday, but maybe not. On that note, I guess we can have one happy thing. We can end it with the uplifting music, I suppose. That's what we'll do, yeah. All right. If anything, it's kind of happy. Sort of. Good night, everybody. Swings.